Hi, my name's Len Losik, and I'm here to talk about using a technology called prognostics health management to stop creating pedophiles. And I'll be discussing research that I did for the Canadian Space Agency back in 2012, and then published a series of papers and books that helped to explain a myriad of medical issues that was discovered as a result of the research that I did for the Canadian Space Agency. And so the title of this presentation is Using PHM, which stands for Prognostics and Health Management Technology to Stop Making More Pedophiles. So why am I the one explaining the cause of pedophiles? As President and Chief Technical Officer of my company, I created the Prognostics and Health Management Technology for space applications that allowed the U.S. Air Force to win funding for the Global Positioning System, otherwise known as GPS, several decades ago. And as a result of that, the technology, the PHM technology, and the research, using it in the research that I did for the Canadian Space Agency, it helped to explain many conditions that occur in the brain that in the past have been unexplained. And so I'm considered a national and international spacecraft and launch vehicle designer and manufacturer, and I've worked at almost every major aerospace and defense company, as well as several computer chip companies. I'm considered an expert in what's called in the field of predictive analytics, and as I mentioned in 2012, we were asked by the Canadian Space Agency to determine the feasibility of using our predictive algorithms to identify which astronauts that were in training would acquire mental illness on a deep space mission. And this presentation will include the results of that research as well as the results of other research. So this is a chart that illustrates some of the companies that I've worked with and worked for in the past in this area. And here are some images of some of the space craft, as well as the constellation of satellites. And this up here in the upper left-hand corner is the constellation known as the GPS system. And each one of those satellites is, I helped to either design and or launch and get it such that its performance was so high that the Air Force funded the program. And the company that I worked for at the time was Boeing. It is now Boeing. And Boeing has accumulated over $4.5 billion in contracts with the Air Force as a result of my work as the Global Positioning System Space and Ground Segment Manager back in when it was funded. And so here's the other spacecraft that I've also worked on: NASA's space station, the NASA Space Shuttle, the constellation of low Earth orbiting telecommunication satellites known as Global Star. I was also the test manager for the Air Force Titan the Titan launch vehicle as the test manager for the solid strap-on motors there on each side of the Titan missile. And this is an image of a geostationary communication satellite that I helped design with the PHM technology. And then this is another satellite, commercial communication satellite. This is an image of NASA's geostationary operational environmental satellite that provides weather pictures in the evening on the news that I was responsible for as a NASA contractor. I was responsible for the design, the manufacture, and test. And then this is a picture of the Hubble telescope, NASA Hubble telescope. They came to me and asked me if I could explain why their gyroscopes the behavior that was occurring on their gyroscopes was completely unexplainable. And so as a result of our research back in 2012, it triggered the production of these 7 books, how GPS was funded, which explains how I developed the prognostics and health management technology that allowed me to predict certain events with 100% certainty. And I then, over the next 30 years, used that technology in the design, manufacture, and test of spacecraft, which is identified in the next book titled The Spaceflight History for PHM Technology. As a result of the research with the Canadian Space Agency in 2012, I published the next book called Curing Mental Illness. And from there, I was able to explain what causes cancer. In the book Curing Mental Illness, I identify what causes mental illness, which was before unknown, and then how to prevent getting mental illness, and if you do get it, how to recover from it. And the same with curing cancer. For the first time, I explained what causes cancer and how to prevent from getting cancer. And if you do get cancer and you get treatment and you recover, how to prevent from getting cancer from returning. The next book is The Cause and Recovery for Childhood Autism, Diabetes, and Arthritis, that can be explained by using PHM technology. And then I also was able to explain how the variability in people's sexes can occur. And what I'm talking about refers to the LGBT community, where the transgender, where the sex of a person can be different in the brain versus the body. And I explain that in this book, again, using PHM technology. And this presentation is going to be about this book titled How to Stop Creating Pedophiles, that I explain with using PHM analysis. And so what is pedophilia? It's an interesting description. It's been around for a long time and has really been considered a mental illness or a mental condition or psychological condition that could be corrected. And what it is a male or female has a single sex attraction to only children. And so that desire for children originates in the brain and starts out at the fetus level while the fetus is in the womb and is uncurable today. I made a mistake there. I put curable, but it's actually not curable today. No, it's no longer defined as a sexual disorder. In the DSM-5, which is the desk reference for psychologists and psychiatrists to determine what is treatable or how to treat, DSM-5 is their desk reference, which was just released within the last couple of years, the latest update, now defines pedophilia as a sexual preference, much as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, and trisexual orientations are considered normal, not normal, but regular sexual preferences, versus being a mental disorder or a psychological disorder. Pedophilia is now given an actual sexual preference, and it's not treatable, and a person who is a pedophile cannot be fixed. And although sexual predators may commit pedophilia, they don't have a single sex and childhood preference as a pedophile does. Sexual predators will go after children as well as adults, and so they're not considered pedophiles. And so I'll explain why Len Losik, myself, is defining how pedophiles are created. These are the different organizations that we look to provide cures for our major illnesses, such as cancer, mental illness, Alzheimer's, childhood cancer, autism, diabetes. And in the pay category, under executive pay, look at the salaries that the executive, the CEO, or whoever runs the organization is making. The Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, the person that heads that makes over $3.5 million a year salary. So these salaries, 2.1 million, 1.7 million, 1.5 million, 1.3 million, these are the salaries of the people that head up these organizations. And there is a myriad of management who makes less salaries. But what happens is this kind of money being given to people who run organizations that are funded fully by donations are not going to approve the research necessary to actually come up with a cure. Because if they did, they would lose their jobs, and all of the thousands of people and hundreds of companies that support these different organizations, whether it be Alzheimer's, cancer, heart attack, you name it, the the organizations that run strictly off of the generosity of the American taxpayer are not going to approve the research that's going to give them the answers that will cause them to lose their jobs. And this is what this chart is meant to show. And the dates here, 2015 and 2016, that's where these salaries came from. And so these people that run these organizations have a terrible conflict of interest when they earn this kind of money. To actually approve the research by the researchers that's actually going to give them the cure. So I'm going to explain how space medical research using PHM technology explains how and why pedophiles are created and how to stop creating more of them. We are actually undergoing many different epidemics in almost every disease that can be associated with the brain. And so that's, I will explain why that occurs as well. This is a chart on the left that shows the different industries that use PHM technology and how it's done, and how it's done, and how much it costs, whether it's proprietary or not, and the accuracy of their predictions. In our case, where we use it in space applications, when we predict something, it's with 100% certainty. It does occur. And that's not always the case. Predictive science has been around for a long time, many, many decades, but it doesn't get used because the predictions are never accurate. They may be around 30 or 40% accuracy. And so the PHM technology that I developed for the spacecraft is 100% accurate 100% of the time. This is the chart that shows the number of satellites in the space industry that are built per year since 1970. And the red ones are the number of satellites that fail. Historically, the space industry suffers about a 25% failure rate. That means for every 10 spacecraft that gets launched, either the launch vehicle fails or the spacecraft fails 25% of the time, causing a total loss of the mission. And so that's a tidbit of information that is very seldom known. And so now that people are interested in providing tourist rides to space, or maybe to the moon, or maybe to Mars, the people that are doing these things don't understand that the reliability of the current space program is so poor, and as attributed by NASA, who a total of 17 astronauts have died, 14 of them while either on their way to space or on their way back. And that's very, very poor odds for the manned space program. And the technology that I'm here today to speak about, PHM technology, will stop those catastrophic failures and the loss of human life, and will decrease the failure rate of spacecraft anywhere from that are currently sitting at about 20 to 25% per year, down to either 1 or 2%. And the technology does not identify design margins. A lot of failures occur in spacecraft during manufacture or test or development due to having the wrong design margins, being under-designed. This technology cannot be used to identify what the proper design margins are on equipment. This is to be used only on those products or equipment that pass testing and then might fail. This is a chart showing some of the spacecraft that have failed as far back as 2010, either launch vehicles or this particular spacecraft, both of them, the replacement spacecraft. This one here failed immediately arriving on orbit, cost $125 million. Its replacement failed immediately, cost $125 million. Plus the launch vehicle that put them up into space was $100 million. So here is $450 million for these two spacecraft, total loss, covered by insurance. But these were private commercial spacecraft that failed. All of these are the failures that have occurred anywhere between 2000 and looks like mainly 2010, 2011, and 2012. And they've been failing since 2013-14 at roughly a 20 to 25% failure rate. This is a chart that shows the mathematics that's used to explain why 25% of the spacecraft can fail. And it's called probability analysis. And probability analysis was adopted back in 1960 to help quantify things. And unfortunately, the person that developed probability analysis has the last name of Markov, and he developed probabilities for one type of behavior only, and that was behavior that was instantaneous and random. And however, industries have used probability analysis to on all kinds of behavior that is not instantaneous and random, and assert that their results, when they do a probability analysis, that their results are valid, and they are completely invalid. The only known behavior that is both instantaneous and random, and there's only one, and that is the solar corona during a Earth eclipse, when the moon eclipses the sun, and the solar corona that occurs, that becomes visible with a full solar eclipse. As far as we know of, with all of the study that we've done with the space satellites of the sun and the solar corona does not obey the laws of physics as we know them, and it appears to be the only thing in our solar system anyway that does do that. And so Markov's probability analysis results are only valid for the behavior of the solar corona, not anything related to spacecraft or any other reliability. So the prognostics in health management, the research that I did to try to find out why it was valid and why it was reliable, resulted in this chart, which explains why spacecraft continue to fail prematurely at about a 25% rate. And what this chart is attempting to show is these are the aging characteristics for different parts within a piece of equipment, and they age at different rates. And what we get to see in our test data is we get to see what's called non-repeatable transient events in the test data, and that's what these little blips are here. And they're transient events. Well, for many decades, those transient events were diagnosed as system noise rather than related to anything happening within the equipment. This chart is meant to show that when one part's aging characteristics gets to a certain point and its performance causes a change in the operating characteristics of the circuit that it's in, and then it causes this transient event that continues to be diagnosed as systemic noise and then ignored. And so this chart is the explanation that goes along with this chart is the chart that was missing since 1960, when spacecraft began failing prematurely, as well as ICBMs, and all military weapon systems fail prematurely. All products that are manufactured around the world have a premature failure rate. Nobody produces any products that does not have a premature failure rate of anywhere between 5 and 25%. PHM technology will take a product that's manufactured by any company, and if they happen to have a 15 or a 20% failure rate in production, we'll bring that down to 1 or 2%. And this is the chart that explains why PHM technology will do that. So some simple mathematics that is meant to explain what PHM technology is refers to the analyze operator. And in calculus, we use the integral to show that we're going to integrate a function. In PHM, to explain how it works, we use this symbol called the analyze operator. And for time series data, this would be like voltage, current, temperature, RPMs, anything that is measured on equipment or products. If you analyze that data, you end up with the results of that analysis is what we'd call diagnostic data. And so when you analyze the results of your diagnostic data here with the analyze operator, you end up with prognostic data. And prognostic data is the ability to predict what's going to happen based on past data, past behavior. And so if you analyze then the results of your prognostic analysis, You then are able to, it comes up with what's called prognostic data, and this is the remaining usable life of whatever it is that you're analyzing. So from PHM technology, we are able to identify the equipment that's going to fail, and then we are also able to tell how much longer it's going to last before it fails. So I'll be explaining what initiated our research into the mental illness. And again, as I mentioned, from our expertise in predictive diagnostics, the Canadian Space Agency asked us if we would check and see if we could predict which astronauts could become mentally ill. And so in 2012, we did that research, and we were able to develop a process to be able to predict which astronauts were in training. Well, the results of the full results of the research was published in 2013. I'm sorry, a partial of that research was published in 2013 at the IEEE AIAA Aerospace Conference, and that our research results were heavily edited by the Canadian Space Agency, because they did not want us to publish the results showing that astronauts were going to become seriously mentally ill. They only wanted us to discuss very benign emotional illnesses of anxiety and depression. However, later on, I published a paper online in the American Journal of Psychology, and with the full results showing how we would be able to predict which astronauts were going to acquire either bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. And so what prognostics and health management is concerned about is premature aging, and that's what causes both people as well as equipment to fail prematurely. And in the case of equipment or products, it's usually parts or equipment or piece parts, components such as resistors or transistors or capacitors are aging too quickly, and we call that premature aging. Well, we know that people under stress also age prematurely, and this meant to show 3 examples of 3 different presidents, before and after pictures of what they looked like after they were in office, illustrating that the body also experiences premature aging under stress. And in our research, we were able to show that the premature aging with people occurs as a result of overexposure to both cortisol and adrenaline that's released by the fight or flight response. And from that release of cortisol and adrenaline, the body experiences an avalanche of additional toxic chemicals that's triggered by their release. Adrenaline and cortisol are both toxic to the body and will kill. And the body was never intended to be exposed to adrenaline and cortisol for extended periods of time. And the premature aging of our presidents is an example of that, an obvious example. Well, our body was meant to simply respond to an instantaneous release of adrenaline and cortisol, and then it would dissipate and go away. However, in today's lifestyle, we are under a far different environment than we were, say, 200 years ago, where we were an agricultural-based community, and our bodies are being exposed to adrenaline and cortisol at exceedingly much higher frequency and for longer durations, causing premature aging as well as premature death. And that's what we were able to identify. What we work for and work on is identifying the presence of premature aging in data. And so from published research, what we found out, which is the basis of almost all pharmaceutical medications that are used for the mentally ill, that the mentally ill experiences what they refer to as self-induced brain damage, where the fight or flight response for the mentally ill has actually changed the ratio of the chemicals in the brain that are the reason that people's realities are altered, that we refer to as mental illness, either schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. And again, that's caused by their own fight or flight response for very specific reasons that I'll be covering later. And so we refer to it as self-induced brain damage and eventually will result in the shrinkage of the frontal lobes of our brain in a measurable way. And that's all caused from the excessive presence of cortisol and adrenaline. And so we propose that both were present from the fight or flight response, and that controls their release in our research. And so in our spaceflight proven proprietary predictive algorithms, this is a list of those that we've developed and used on spacecraft, just to show you, the algorithm name, and then what the purpose of those algorithms to be looked at another time. So these were developed over a period of time and have been used and proven over several decades of use. So the cause, be covering now the cause of the epidemics in childhood autism, arthritis, diabetes, cancer, allergies, autoimmune and immune system diseases, and pedophilia, and how to stop creating people with those conditions, and in some cases being able to reverse and recover from them as well. And so our first step, I'll explain the environment that causes pedophilia that's been created by the inadvertent dismantling of the two-parent family. And then our step 2, I'll explain how the quality of life that a pregnant mother experiences is related to the epidemics of pedophilia, mental illness, gender confusion, homosexuality, autism, cancer, diabetes, arthritis, and all non-genetic based autoimmune and immune system diseases. And so after World War II, a change in the U.S. manufacturing had to occur. Almost all American companies were producing weapons of some kind, and then when the war ended, that manufacturing process had to end. Well, the companies looked around to see what they could use to replace their business that they were selling to the government. And what they chose to focus on was making home appliances that had never been manufactured before. And I'm just talking simply things like toasters, washers and dryers, garbage disposals, heaters, internal heaters for either air conditioning or inside heating, toiletries, inside toilets. And those are things that in the past didn't exist in large quantities, and if they did, they weren't affordable. But when many companies started producing large quantities of them, it allowed the price to come way down so that the average person and average family could afford them. And so when the household started using these appliances, all of a sudden it made it possible for a single parent to run a household without a spouse. In the past, before home appliances were so popular, it required both mother and father to be able to do all of the work that was necessary to run a household, because it was a lot of heavy work. Oftentimes men would cook because the pots and pans were too heavy for women to pick up and to cook with. Cutting wood, making a fire, all of the things at that time in an agricultural based community required a husband and a wife. And then when home appliances became extremely popular, it meant that a two-parent family was no longer necessary, that a single-parent family could function, but it wasn't optimal for the child. However, that was ignored, and the expansion of the single-parent family started in the early 1950s and had grew until I think the late 1990s, and I'll show you the rate at which that single-parent family grew in another upcoming chart. So this is an indication of the divorce rates that occurred currently for many different races of people, and the length of the first marriage, and then their failure rates for a wide variety of different races, which is very high. Currently in the United States, the first marriage divorce rate is over 60%, and the divorce rate for the second marriage is over 75%. In 1953, as companies had begun switching over to making home appliances, the Cold War started with the Soviet Union, and that meant that the U.S. aerospace and defense industries was triggered to start producing en masse weapons of size and power that had never been made before, even for World War II. And what the U.S. Aerospace and defense companies were doing were primarily taking the weapon systems that Adolf Hitler developed to fight his enemies in Europe and the United States and made them better. Hitler started using a lot of weapons that didn't violate the Versailles Treaty that Germany had signed to end World War I. And as a consequence, he couldn't be charged, with violating the Versailles Treaty because he was using very sophisticated weapons, the cruise missile, the ICBM, the jet fighter. Those were all things that didn't exist at World War I. And so when he funded their development by his military, they were all new. Fortunately, by 1945, we were able to defeat him, and we immediately rushed in along with the Soviet Union and gathered up as many of the documents that we could that helped us to understand how he manufactured those weapons. We brought ours back to the United States, the Soviet Union brought theirs back to the Soviet Union, and we both started a Cold War and a race to develop the biggest and baddest weapon systems. However, the positive side of that was that the number of jobs, high-paying, high-quality jobs that was created after 1953 in the United States was massive with the aerospace and defense industry. And President Eisenhower actually, when he was president, warned the American people that said that be wary of the aerospace and defense industries because they were so large and so powerful, and their contracts had so much money that they could actually influence the results of wars and conflicts with their weapon systems. And so they themselves had a conflict of interest. If peace broke out, they would go out of business. As long as war and conflict existed, they were able to manufacture and sell these systems and make a great deal of profit. And so our own companies that helped us fight the Cold War, again, also was a source of the conflict between ending the war or keeping the war going. And that was the warning that President Eisenhower gave the American people when he was no longer president, or excuse me, at the end of his presidency. I'm sorry, I wanted to go through some of these weapons that we got from World War II and Hitler and other countries. As I mentioned, the cruise missile, the intercontinental ballistic missile, the jet fighter, the radar-controlled weapons, data encryption, signal detection and location, signal intelligence, and submarine warfare. And those were all things that was used in World War II by the Third Reich and Adolf Hitler, and a little bit by other countries such as Great Britain. So in 1967, President Johnson offered financial dependency on the taxpayer for those people that were at or below the poverty level, thinking that if you gave people money, that they were no longer going to be in poverty. And after 15 years of not improving the poverty rate within the United States, those local, county, and state programs were all stopped by President Ronald Reagan, seeing the fact that by giving people money, it did nothing more than make them dependent on that money, rather than it was not looked at as a hand up, but as a hand out. People then began learning how to live on the free money that they got from their state or local programs, and it became a generational program where mothers would raise their children, and the children would get on these social programs where they were given money instead of going out and getting jobs. And so eventually in 1995, I think I'll cover it a little bit later, President Clinton signed the Welfare to Work program, which ended the generational programs where people's children got on government money and allowed them to only have a maximum of 5 years of handouts and then be forced to find a job and go to work. And so in 1967, the War on Poverty program unintentionally incentivized single parenting by giving more money to single mothers and more money for each child that a single unmarried mother had. And so for each child they got more money, and the mother was unemployed and usually was out of wedlock. motivating single mothers and fathers to not marry, but have more children and receive more government money. And so this program eventually created the generational welfare system, where children of single mothers had their children out of wedlock, often with several fathers providing children, and marriage and two-parent family was financially penalized by the federal government in form of higher taxes. So in 1973, President Nixon opened a trade with China, initiating the movement of over 80,000 companies to relocate abroad, creating the greatest loss of American jobs in the U.S. history. Well, with this loss of opportunity, it started more frequent hostility at homes, because there wasn't the amount of jobs that we had at one time after World War II. Jobs were harder to come by, high-paying. There was fewer high-paying jobs. And so it's led to instability in the home, starting what was known as a nationwide epidemic of child neglect, child abuse, and even incest within these homes, as one or both parents were forced to work outside the home, earning half pay, creating the first latchkey generation of children. And this chart is simply meant to show that from 1976 up to 2011, the number of cases that the police were called for maltreatment allegations that they had to respond to. In 1989, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Congress immediately cut all military funding, causing the greatest reduction in military employment and contractor employment since the end of World War II. That meant that all those people that were working on those jobs, they all lost their jobs, they all lost their form of income. Those were all, a lot of them were high-paying, white-collar jobs, and those families that relied on that money were suddenly thrust into poverty. And in 1992, President Clinton then began closing the greatest number of military facilities in the United States, and primarily in California received the largest number of base closures, because at the time California was a Republican state and President Clinton was a Democrat, and it made sense politically to close the bases that were in Republican states versus closing the bases that were in Democratic states. And California had the most military bases at the time, primarily along the coast, and almost all of those bases were closed immediately. All those people lost their jobs. They had little job skills. They were expecting to stay in the military and make that a career. And so that contributed to, again, fewer jobs, more hostility at home, and more single parents. And so from 1989 to 1995, the number of U.S. jobs that were reduced to pre-World War II levels, and leaving many people unemployed, or in jobs that paid far less than what they were used to, forcing either both parents to work, if there was two parents, and creating, as I mentioned earlier, the latchkey children. And it at this time was the largest growth in childcare, where if there was two-parent family, and certainly in a single-parent family, you had to rely on childcare center. So during these decades, saw the largest growth in childcare centers and unemployed relatives. And with relatives unemployed, many combined households. And as a result, the #1 call that the police, all police across the nation, had to respond to became domestic violence and child incest, as a result of the relatives sexually abusing the children that they were present in the home while they were staying there unemployed. In 1995, as I mentioned, the financial reward for the single parent was stopped temporarily by President Clinton when he signed the Welfare to Work program, and creating only a 5-year welfare program before people had to get a job. Many recipients of welfare went to work, stopping the generational welfare program, but it added even more stress to find employment in an environment in which jobs were disappearing en masse by the millions. Companies were moving overseas to lower wage employees where they didn't have to provide benefits. In addition, the taxes were lower. And so the United States during this time, companies were fleeing, the government was closing down the military, and jobs were getting harder and harder to find. which caused more and more hostility at home if there was a two-parent family, and certainly even in a single-parent family with the stress of not being able to find a good-paying job. Again, that was taken out on children. And so in 1995, the U.S. was still in a declining employment environment that was caused by the exodus of U.S. companies with the immigration of over 11 million unskilled immigrants who were poorly educated and had very little skills. And then in 1992, with the massive reduction in the military, it meant that the jobs for the Americans was very, very hard to find. And so some states actually restarted the long-term welfare program to help give some relief to those families who couldn't find a job. And so it was only some states, and not all states did that. But the Welfare to Work program that was signed by President Clinton in 1995 ended in many states as a result of our poor job environment. And so in 2017, under President Trump, the move of U.S. companies to other countries and the widespread use of lower wage foreign employees began to get reversed, ending after, as I mentioned, over 80,000 U.S. companies relocated outside the U.S., with an unknown number of foreign workers replacing U.S. citizens at lower wages, increasing the American unemployment for the less educated and the less skilled. And in addition, the IRS has been rewarding these 80,000 companies here to move out. So when they moved to another country, all of their costs associated with relocating to other countries to pay lower taxes, to use lower skilled workers, to use lower paid workers, the IRS rewarded them with allowing them to write those off as tax exemptions, thus giving them a huge financial incentive to actually relocate out of the United States. From 1973 to today, the loss of jobs and lowered wages of American workers, these are some of the stats for the manufacturing employment, showing the decrease in the number of jobs from 1970 to 2015. The slide down here, in 2001, when China joins the World Trade Organization, was allowed to join, you can see the huge decrease in American jobs as American companies moved over to China. And Americans lost the jobs that went over to China. Here are the wages versus the gross domestic product during the same time, from 1959 to 2014. You can just see what wages did as a result of all of the companies leaving the United States. A lot of low-skilled immigrants were coming into the country, replacing Americans. And these are published by a variety of sources, including Business Insider, as well as many other sources. So from 1950 to today, the U.S. divorce rate increased to over 50% from under 10% in 1950, as well as the second marriage rate today at over 75%. In this chart, it just simply meant to show, along with the divorce rate and the financial crisis, and when households were combining, what the sexual abuse rates change was. In 1980, it was under, this is abuse per 1,000 children, at 0.7. You can just see from 1980 to 1993 what the sexual abuse rate for children was as a result of the new types of homes across the country. And this source is from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that was published back in 1996. So to summarize, in 2000, the dot-com crash caused the loss of over 150,000 jobs just in the San Francisco Bay Area alone for skilled and unskilled workers. The September 11th bombing of the trade towers in New York caused the American economy to stall, and more than 2.5 million more jobs were lost as a result, on top of the dot-com bust in 2000. And so in 2006, the financial collapse, where the banks were found to be selling very high-risk investments as low-risk investments around the world, another 2.6 million jobs were lost as a result of the 2006 financial collapse. And so, again, the most common police response during these times became and remains domestic violence between a husband and a wife or a mother and a father, followed by the incest of the children in these homes. With the consolidation of the unemployed family members into one home, incest remains the second highest call for police responses, as unemployed family members were used for child care. And the number one police response, again, remains domestic violence. Yes, here's some charts showing the decline of religious interest in religion. In the 1990s, the so-called Greatest Generation attack on religious lifestyle increased, resulting in a reduction in attendance at church and the importance of the church's doctrine in day-to-day life. A huge reduction in influence on personal behavior that actually could be associated with the 2006 financial collapse after the loss of religious pressure to do the right thing for, quote, salvation. As a result of the attack on religious doctrine, another huge rise in crime, single motherhood, domestic violence, child molestation, homelessness, autism, mental illness, childhood arthritis, cancer, pedophilia, unemployment, and blue and white collar crime occurred across the entire United States. And these are two charts that illustrate these things. With the decline in religion interest from 1952 to 2013 came the number of cases of autism, came the epidemic in autism. This is the chart that starts back in 1993. And it just shows the epidemic of autism that occurs as a result of the hostile home life that pregnant mothers were living in, as well as the domestic violence during this time. And I'm trying to see if I can read when this was published. Who published this? I can't find number of cases. Who published this? More examples of the decline in the quality of family life in the United States on charts shows that the rate of imprisonment in state prisons from 1978 to 2007 for the unemployed American citizen grew from 1980, here's the chart, to 2005. And this is for those that are black, and we have white, Hispanic, Native, and Asian, and it just shows a terrible increase. And so America, this chart shows that how America had become a nation of dual, when America, United States, became a nation of dual income working couples. What happened was this was the growth for both, where both spouses working, where from the traditional family of the 1950s, the mother stayed home and raised the children, the father went off to work. Well, beginning in 1965, this shows the increase where both spouses had to work, because quite often they were making half or a small portion of the salaries that they were used to getting when there was many more jobs and companies in the United States. And so at the bottom is the decrease where the husband only is working, allowing the mother to stay home with their child, and the top curve shows how the rate at which both spouses went to work from 1965 to 2010. So the second step in understanding the cause of pedophilia, as well as epidemics and these other disorders, I'll explain how the quality of life is related to the epidemics in all of these things: mental illness, pedophilia, gender confusion, and so on. So when we did our research back in 2012, there was no understanding of what caused mental illness. And so in order for us to be able to predict when mental illness occurs, we had to be able to understand what caused it. So our research was able to identify the cause of mental illness and how to recover it. At the time we started our research, and currently today, doctors, psychologists, the treatment is still a medication, and medication for the rest of your life. One of the results of our research was able to show how to get off of medication. Once you understand what causes mental illness and make some behavioral changes, you can actually stop taking, the need for medication decreases greatly, and could actually stop taking the medication altogether. And these were the information that we started with when we started our research for the Canadian Space Agency, and the mental illness or emotional illness of depression, major depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. And there were no available definitions for these conditions. They were all described simply by their symptoms. And that means that the industry did not understand what caused them. All they knew was about these conditions were their symptoms. And so that's how they were described. And so when you see something that's described by their symptoms, you can know that the industry does not understand what causes them. And so here was the understanding at the time of whether there was any changes to the brain, was it reversible or not, and what the treatments were. And universally, the treatments were talk therapy and drugs. And so this is the results from our work here in the blue, where we took the old definitions and we were able to rewrite them, and understanding the cause of mental illness being the fight or flight response, and how it responds to people that live in an excessively violent or hostile environment, as determined by the person's fight or flight response, completely outside of the person's consciousness. The fight or flight response is working. We also know the fight or flight response as the subconscious mind. When the subconscious mind is activated in a self-protection mode, it becomes the fight or flight response. When the fight or flight response is no longer needed, it goes back to becoming the subconscious. And that's what we were able to define. And so in our research, we applied principles from electrical engineering, communication science, PHM technology, and the results from research in DNA, AIDS, and cancer research to predict and prevent the conditions of childhood autism, arthritis, diabetes, cancer, mental illness, gender expansion, pedophilia, and all the non-genetic based diseases. And so for stopping and preventing recovery from these conditions, we had to understand what was occurring. And what was occurring was that the subconscious or the fight or flight response wasn't able to communicate with the conscious mind. Quite often people learn to either suppress or become out of touch with their emotions and feelings that come up from either the subconscious or the fight or flight response. And since the fight or flight response is what we call a rule-based system, it's programmed, through millions of years of evolution. It is locked into, if it sees danger, it has to respond 100% of the time. And so we don't know this is occurring consciously. It's outside of our awareness, how the fight or flight response interprets information. To our conscious mind, something may seem completely safe, but our subconscious mind is collecting far more data than just our conscious mind is aware of. And so it works completely independently. And so we learned that the symptoms of emotional and mental illnesses were being caused by the fight or flight response as a result of people becoming out of touch with the communications with their subconscious / fight or flight response. Okay, so what we describe is the conscious only communicates with the fight or flight response externally using our senses, our voice, our touch. There's very, very little communications with our brain internally to our fight or flight response. You might call that a bandwidth. When we're talking about digital data, the bandwidth between our brain internally to our fight or flight response might be about 1 bit per second. However, if you're looking at the data that the fight or flight response receives from all of our senses, it could be a gigabit per second. In the billions and billions of data versus very little data coming from our brain to it. And so effectively all information goes one way, from the ears, nose, tongue, skin, nervous system, and the conscious comes directly out of the fight or flight response. The fight or flight response then decides what small amount of information is sent up to the conscious mind for the conscious to create what we call reality. The conscious would be overloaded with information if all the information from our senses was fed up to the conscious mind. And that's the data that the subconscious mind fight or flight response is working with. It's working with all of the data, whereas our conscious mind is only working with a tiny, tiny fraction of the data that's available to us. So the region of the brain that creates the conscious has not been identified. Apparently, it takes so little energy to create our conscious mind. With the current methods that we use to identify the activity of the brain, we cannot see how the brain expends the energy to create our conscious mind. It is so low in the amount, and that's an indication of how simple our conscious mind is. So what we say is the conscious mind is made or created by contributions from each of the different areas of the brain at a very, very low level of energy. And so we tried to come up with this is an explanation of how digital data, zeros and ones, is sent over electronic lines, whether it be in the computer or over the telephone lines or over over the internet. These are the design parameters that must be satisfied. And this is, if you're talking about bits, zeros and ones, the ratio of the energy in a single bit to the amount of noise that's behind that bit, that ratio has to be a certain level. And then for analog data like volts or temperatures, continuous data, we call what's important is with the signal, the information over the noise level. And it's the ratio of the information to how much electrical noise is present. And then if a way to quantify how well this communication system is working is how many bit errors are occurring, whether it be analog or digital data. And so in the case of analog data, we look at signal strength, and we also have to look at noise strength. But for digital data, we look at the bit error rate. How many bit errors are occurring? And so that then degrades the quality of the message if there's a high bit rate with digital data. And if there's too much noise in analog data, it erodes the reliability of the analog data. So this is the kind of information that we use from the principles of electrical engineering and communications theory in order to explain communications. Now, and that's pretty much what I just mentioned on this chart. This just shows different types of ways that information is put on electrical signal. Biphase shift keying, quadriphase shift keying that is used. There's many different formats that are used in different industries to get a 0 or a 1 on an electrical signal and then be able to get that information off. And that's called modulation, and then getting the data off the signal is called demodulation. So these are different, these are formats, the different formats that I was just referring to. NRZL, non-return to zero level, and here's a non-return to zero mark. And then here's biphase, level, biphase, mark. These are different ways that technically we can define a 0 and a 1. And this is just a small subset of what's available to the electrical engineer who's designing communication systems. So these are all different ways of defining what a 0 and a 1 looks like. And there's many more than that that's being employed on a continuous basis. Primarily for increasing bandwidth at no additional cost within a system. And so what we had to do was then figure out, well, how does the brain communicate? And that's something that's been done by other people, so we didn't have to do that ourselves. We just took the research that other people did that described how the brain is able to send information around the brain in the nervous system. And so this is a similar type block diagram that we used in electrical engineering for the nervous system, for the conscious and the subconscious, showing where the data comes from, about what the data rates are for each of those, whether it be to the conscious and subconscious, trying to come up with a similar type of understanding for our brain that we have for a computer. And so by defining the cause of diseases as an inability of our consciousness to communicate with the fight or flight response / subconscious, we can then define the cause of mental disorders and all non-genetic based diseases. And this is a great image to try to show the size. If this was the brain, how much of the brain is actually attributable to the conscious mind versus the subconscious mind or the fight or flight response. So Our approach to defining mental illness was we assumed that the brain and the nervous system was closed, and then we used the principles of communication sciences to identify how the communications was interrupted. It didn't exist. So we know that the brain communicates between the subconscious and the conscious using feelings, emotions, and hunches. And what we then just needed to be able to explain was how did that communications get altered? Why did it stop? And it has to do with abuse as a child and what's referred to as survival skills, where one of the things that almost every child does that's in an either abusive or neglectful environment is that they shut down their ability to feel their emotions because it's simply overwhelming for them to do so while they're being neglected and abused by their caretakers. And so why does mental illness have to occur? Mental illness has to occur because it's the message that the fight or flight response is sending to the conscious mind to let it know it's doing everything wrong. And that's because in the human brain, in the human head, the brain is locked in a skeleton, unlike the rest of the body. The rest of the body, when there's an injury, when there's a problem, there are all the sensors in the body, and the skin and the bones, we feel pain. And that information is then sent to the brain to let it know that, hey, something's wrong with a part of the body. Well, in the brain can't do that because it's locked in a skeleton. And so it developed the ability to change the chemical ratios within the brain in order to tell the conscious mind that it's doing a lot wrong and to change. So when the conscious mind ignores feelings, emotions, and other messages from the fight or flight response, as I mentioned, this occurs for people that are as young children or adults that are forced to ignore their emotions and their feelings. And so these are some of the different words that we use to describe our emotions and our feelings and our conditions. For instance, under happy, if we were happy, we might be pleased, we might be glad, we might feel wonderful, be elated, be excited, be content, be surprised. And under sad, we include sad if we're hurt, if we're feeling pity, if we're bored, if we're tired, wounded, if we're feeling fragile, or think of ourselves as being fragile. Fragile is not a feeling. If we're being overused. Anyway, these are some of the words that go with each of the feelings that the fight or flight response or our subconscious sends up to our conscious mind to let us know how it's doing. So, an explanation of the power of the fight or flight response and its purpose, also known as our subconscious when not activated, on how it decides what is safe. So, this is an image of the brain that's been overexposed to cortisol and adrenaline. Now, the normal brain usually is a nice circular round. This shows what happens when a brain is overexposed to cortisol and adrenaline. And working in a space program, an astronaut will lose 10% of its body mass every 6 months while the astronaut's in space. That includes brain tissue. All of the body rhythms will also be distorted as a result of the atrophy, of the destruction of the brain. And this is what we chose to look at, how we were able to determine whether or not a person was going to become mentally ill while in space. And that had to do with where they were at during their training. So with the brain damage, although a person can function pretty normally, once they hit later in life at about 50, as the body physiology significantly changes, is where those things that a person did in their early years are going to come back and affect them in their later years. So before mental illness occurs, though, the fight or flight response gives the conscious mind many, many chances to avoid the self-induced brain damage. And terms that help understand what those are is the word threat, stress versus stressors, and triggers. Those are the words that people need to understand when they're being concerned about emotional illnesses, emotional conditions, as well as mental disorders. These are the words that have greatest effect to people with either emotional and or mental illnesses. So an example of a body's response to triggers would include unexplainable high or low blood pressure, surprise perspiration, insomnia, inability to sleep, heart palpitations, having anxiety, which is the subconscious or the fight or flight response, seeing imminent death. Anxiety is the message that the subconscious gives to the conscious mind when it sees imminent death in that person's behavior. Depression's another one, which is an unawareness or an inability to feel emotions and feelings. Many people will describe people who are sad or down as being depressed and feeling sad. And depression is just the opposite. Depression is the inability to feel anything, any emotions. That's what's causing people to go down and to be confused and not to be sad, because if they can feel sad, then they're not depressed. And so depression is the inability to feel the messages from either the subconscious or the fight or flight response. A person also would be getting the messages of having mood swings, otherwise known as bipolar disorder, and there'll be unexplained irritability. Everybody, I think, can understand mouth, tongue, and lip sores. That's a message from our fight or flight response that says, we're doing something wrong, change it. And then near continuous chapped lips. Years ago, there used to be concerns about people that they considered had an addiction to, they were addicted to chapped lip balm. And they were putting chapped lip balm on their lips because their fight or flight response was drying out their lips, trying to give it a message that they were doing something wrong. And instead of making changes in their life, they covered their lips up with balm without making any changes to their lifestyle. So it just allowed them to cover up the symptoms that the body was using to tell them that they're doing something wrong. Then also there could be obsessive behaviors. One is, we know it's called OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, would fit in there. So those are all messages that the fight or flight response gives to people, indicating that the fight or flight response wants them to make changes, big changes in their life, or serious mental illness is going to result. So here's examples of the body responses to stressors. It's kind of similar things: heartburn, hemorrhoids, gastrointestinal issues, Crohn's disease, again, mouth and tongue sores, skin infections, pimples, rashes, colds or flus, chapped lips again, an increase in the number of things that you're allergic to, and social withdrawal, not wanting to be around people. Again, these are the messages that our subconscious and our fight or flight response gives to our conscious mind to try to get it to make changes in their behavior, in their decision making. So many people believe that people that become mentally ill is from biology. And quite often you'll hear the saying, mental illness runs in families. Well, if mental illness is caused by poor raising by caretakers of the children that they're responsible for, so much so that the children has to learn to shut off their feelings and their emotions, if that's how those children are raised, when they grow up and they have children, they're going to raise their children much as they were raised, in a condition in which their children are going to have to shut off their awareness of their feelings. And so it is a generation that's passed from one generation or the other if it's not broken by one of the parents. And so there's where the confusion lies, is because when there's lousy caretakers that cause either, and that can be defined as being neglectful and abusive to their children are likely going to be the same way to their children, and their children are going to be likely the same way to their children, unless the syndrome is broke. And that's where the confusion comes in. It is not biological, meaning DNA, but it's passed on from one bad parent to their children, who then passes it on to their children. So we say that all mental illnesses are completely environmental, having nothing to do with biology. So what we decided how we were going to be able to predict which astronauts were going to become mentally ill in our research was we were going to look at the body rhythms, the circadian, the diurnal, ultradian, and infradian rhythms. These are the things that controls all of our body functions on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and some of which you're familiar with. And so those were the things that we said, if you collect data on these items, we would be able, during training of an astronaut, we would be able to predict which astronauts were going to become mentally ill as a result of a processing of the data using our algorithms. So we happen to focus primarily on the circadian ultradian rhythms because those are generated deep in the central part of the brain next to where we believe where the fight or flight response is triggered and provides the timing for all periodic body functions. Real deep in the brain, which is very near in the thalamus area and the hippocampus area, real deep in the brain. And all of our results are all validated by the pharmaceutical industries, meaning that they use the exact same assumptions when they come up with new drugs that we used in our research to be able to show that we could predict which people were going to become mentally ill. So back to the chart that showed premature aging in equipment, we could use that same chart to show in the brain which person was going to become mentally ill and which portions of the brain were going to be damaged or shrunken as a result of exposure to either excessive cortisol or excessive adrenaline or both. So the same chart that we use that shows which equipment is going to fail prematurely on spacecraft, we can do the same thing for a person to show which person is going to acquire mental illness on a space mission. And this is a photograph, shows a series of photographs indicating the damaged brain of the mentally ill, from a healthy brain down to when they become mentally ill, the damage that results as a result of overexposure to cortisol and adrenaline from stress. So, applying predictive algorithms to illustrate premature aging of the brain to predict mental illness using data from the circadian rhythms and ultradian rhythms will follow here. So these are the kinds of data that engineers use and doctors use in order to look and see how the body's working. And likewise here, this is blood pressure, plasma, cortisol, melatonin. These are the kind of measurements that we needed, the kind of data that we needed to be processed by our algorithms in order to identify which astronauts in training were going to become mentally ill. Here is what a normal chart looks like for melatonin, and this is melatonin for those people over a 24-hour period that would become mentally ill on a deep space mission. And you can see over a 24-hour period, in the sleep phase, melatonin rises and then comes back to low during the daytime period. And you can see how it's so distorted for a person that has or is under excessive stress that will cause them to eventually become mentally ill. So by knowing how the mental illness occurs, we can then use it to prevent all of these terrible conditions that I've been talking about. And so thanks to AIDS, DNA, and cancer research, we are able to explain what causes each of those. And unfortunately, we've been at war with cancer since the 1960s. And all we got out of that, all that money, all those donations from the 1960s until now was chemotherapy and smaller surgeries. When AIDS research occurred, it forced researchers to go down to the virus level. Cancer researchers never went down to the virus level in size. They always stayed up at the cell size. And so when AIDS research was forced to work in viruses, they found that's when it was discovered that viruses causes not only AIDS, but viruses causes cancer. And so we had already known that the presence of the viruses in a person's body is controlled by our fight or flight response, because the fight or flight response controls the immune system. And it's the immune system that controls keeps under wraps all the viruses that are in our body. So when the very first thing that happens when the fight or flight response is initiated is it forgets about the immune system, doesn't need it. It's expecting to either stand and fight somebody or run away. And under those conditions, you don't really need an immune system. And so it just lets it go. And while it's not being controlled, it's allowing whatever viruses that are in our body to grow, to expand, every virus is now free to do what it wants to do, and that's reproduce. And so when the fight or flight response is triggered, the very first thing that happens is the immune system is allowed to do whatever it wants, and the viruses grow terribly. Well, when we're younger, our body is able to sustain that. But once we hit 50, once we hit a 50 or over, our immune system's effectiveness decreases by over 90% from what it was in our 40s and 30s and 20s. The effectiveness of our immune system by 90%. And so that means if you're living in a high stress environment in which the fight or flight response is triggered on a regular basis, the likelihood of you getting cancer or any of the other diseases after 50 skyrockets. And you can see that in people in general. After they become over 50, the amount of illnesses, serious illnesses, including cancer, just becomes excessive. So, how we age in the DNA research, as people were looking at DNA, they saw the ends of the DNA strands, and they called those telomeres. And what they found out was, on a new telomere, there's 50 little segments on or caps on the ends of these DNA, and those reflect the number of times that a cell can regenerate. And so what DNA research found was that each cell in our body can reproduce itself for 50 times. There's 50 little segments on the end of each one of our DNA strands. And so each cell has an opportunity to reproduce 50 times. After the caps are used up, the cell disappears. And as we age, and if we're in a high-stressed environment where we have excessive exposure to cortisol and adrenaline, those caps are going to use up much quicker, and so we're going to lose cells faster, and we're going to age prematurely. And so pedophilia, as I talked about earlier, it's caused by the fetus's fight or flight response changing its brain's chemistry, just as an adult or a child's fight or flight response does so when it's been exposed to either neglect or abuse excessively, and its fight or flight response decides to change its brain chemistry because that person's not able to get out of that hostile or dangerous environment. His or her fight or flight response does not know that. It just wants it to get into a safe condition, and people aren't able to do that, and so the fight or flight response causes mental illness. When a fetus is in the mother's womb and the mother is living in a hostile or violent environment with her partner or with her family, the same triggering event by the fetus's fight or flight response can cause a change in the chemistry of its brain. And remember that in the fetus, that brain is developing. And so when the fight or flight response changes the chemistry of a fetus's brain, in a developing brain, it is not going to develop normally. And as a result, we end up with, after the fetus is born, we end up with children with autism, with childhood autism, which is a permanent brain damage, diabetes, childhood arthritis, mental illness, as well as later on in life, mental illness as well as pedophilia, also with serious immune and autoimmune system diseases. The same physiological process that adults and children, how they get mental illness, the fetus expresses the same physiological process in the womb when its mother lives in a hostile or noisy or what the fetus decides is a dangerous environment. Its fight or flight response causes the brain chemistry to change, resulting in changes in the brain's development that ends up with terrible conditions that include, as I mentioned, pedophilia, homosexuality, bisexuality, gender confusion, cancer, diabetes, mental illness, autism, immune and autoimmune system diseases, including arthritis, such things as Crohn's diseases. Those are all autoimmune diseases. So, what occurs to a developing fetus's brain when the fight or flight response induces the same chemical changes that causes mental illness in either children or adults? I just went through them. Pedophilia, autism, mental illness, homosexuality, bisexuality, gender confusion, also trisexuality, which includes transsexuals, and then immune and autoimmune system diseases, and arthritis, diabetes, and cancer. So depending on where the depending on where the fetus is at in its development cycle, when the fight or flight response changes the chemistry, decides which of these terrible conditions it's going to have after it's being born. So our work that we did was published to NASA headquarters back in 2013, and as a result of our research, NASA decided immediately to start a long-term study to define what the degradation to the human body was for astronauts in space. And over the last year, some of the results of that study were released, indicating horrendous damage to a person's brain occurs while in space. That included, they were able to look back at all of the astronauts and their brains, not just the recent ones, by an independent medical company that was hired by NASA to participate in the study. And what they found was that when an astronaut goes to space, the astronaut's brain actually folds in on itself while it's in zero gravity and then floats to the top of its skull. And they don't know, there's no way of knowing what damage that occurs. And so in addition to shrinking as a result of excessive exposure to adrenaline and cortisol, you have this, contraction or folding of the astronaut's brain in on itself and then floating to the top of the skull. And so when they come back to Earth, there's really never been any long-term study of the astronauts in the past, as there will be now, as a result of the study that we triggered with NASA to look at more deeply the effects on the astronaut's brain, because we found out that we could predict which astronauts were going to become mentally ill using our proprietary predictive algorithm. So the first astronauts that were in the study were a set of twins. And he was supposed to be up in space for 12 months. His health declined so rapidly that they had to bring him back after 10 months. And he's since had to retire. He's in such terrible condition, both physically and mentally, that he's had to retire and get out of the astronaut program. And they are now looking at all astronauts. And in addition to our research, our recommendation was that we asked NASA to start looking at manned space programs to provide artificial gravity, so these terrible things that happen to astronauts in zero gravity wouldn't happen. And so when they wanted to send astronauts to Mars to build a spacecraft that would provide artificial gravity. And so as yet, NASA hasn't agreed to do so. And really the design is nothing more than what came out in the 1950s, which was a rotating space station. So the technology's been known, the ability to provide artificial gravity has been known about for many decades. But NASA has been resisting doing it because it causes the cost of the spacecraft to go up tremendously, as well as the space program itself to spend a whole lot more money, and NASA doesn't want to do that. So, as I mentioned, our unofficial results from NASA's Astronaut Degradation Study Program, Low-Term Exposure, and this has to do with here's the part of the brain that collapses actually in onto itself, causing serious brain damage. Also, the fluid sacs behind each eye of the astronaut fills, causing the eyeballs to deform, resulting in blindness. 10% of the body mass lost every 6 months it does not come back because those cells atrophy, they actually die, they do not come back. And then what they found out was 100% of the astronaut's DNA was stretched, with only 93% of it returning back to normal length. And nobody has any idea what the long-term consequences of that has on any particular astronaut. So in summary, pedophilia is caused by a fetus. Fetus's fight or flight response triggering a chemical racial change in the brain due to the fight or flight response determination that its powerlessness and or out of control over the conscious, that is the mother, the pregnant mother, refusal to remove the threats that she may or may not even be aware of to the fetus's fight or flight response. The creation of more pedophiles can be stopped by having pregnant women live in a nonviolent, calm lifestyle as defined by their fetus, not by themselves, but by their fetus. And living either with their family in a calm and quiet environment or with their partner, a husband or spouse or friend. But it needs to be in a safe and quiet lifestyle so that the fetus's fight or flight response doesn't determine that it's in an unsafe condition. The progression of the fight or flight response caused diseases can be stopped simply by meeting the needs of the fight or flight response, which is nothing more than living in a calm and quiet, non-violent, non-hostile living environment. And mental illness occurs on manned space missions, and mental illnesses will occur during any future NASA or private low Earth orbit, lunar or deep space missions to other planets. And remember that I said after age 50, our body begins getting ready for our elder years, with our immune system's effectiveness decreasing by over 90%, and our ability to heal slows drastically, and our fight or flight response and our viruses will then dictate our health after 50. Without changing to a low or no stress environment, the fight or flight response will suppress our immune system and allow the viruses to grow, causing premature aging and then death from many of the diseases that I mentioned about, but specifically cancer. And so our conclusions is that the fight or flight response of a fetus triggers the physiological changes in its brain that are later expressed in adults as pedophilia. Our fight or flight response is always in control of our behavior and only allows the conscious to make minor decisions, tricking people into believing that the conscious mind is in control at all times. Our body's health is controlled in only a minor way by our conscious mind, and diseases and death occurs from all diseases, non-genetic based diseases, and death, and including premature death occurs from our fight or flight response, whose presence in our body is there to protect us, is responsible, and keeping us safe is actually the cause of our premature death. Ignoring the needs of the fight or flight response for the conscious mind's needs will cause severe diseases, premature aging, and premature death. Our fight or flight response that protects us from harm in the extreme short term betrays us later, causing major diseases followed by premature death when its messages to our conscious mind are ignored. And the need for medications can be reduced or eliminated by learning to satisfy the needs of the fight or flight response over the needs of the conscious mind, by removing the threats to the person as identified by the fight or flight response, not the conscious mind. Okay, and then using our technology and data from the different rhythms, the circadian, ultradian rhythms, allows astronauts and future space tourists to prevent and recover from mental illness in the event that they acquire it. And that concludes my presentation.